Désolé. Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à la table ronde Utopie Noire. Avant toute chose, j'aimerais prendre le temps de reconnaître que les terres sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons pour notre événement sont situées sur des territoires indigènes non cédés. La nation 𝗨𝗨𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 est reconnue comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. Djodjagé, appelé aussi Montréal, est historiquement connu comme un lieu de rassemblement pour de nombreuses Premières Nations. Aujourd'hui, elle abrite une population diversifiée de peuples autochtones et autres. Nous respectons les liens continus avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir dans nos relations avec les peuples autochtones et autres au sein de la communauté montréalaise. En tant qu'organisation, 𝗨𝗪𝗍 inégalités, axée sur la justice sociale, nous pensions qu'il est crucial d'être informé des conséquences passées et présentes du colonialisme. Nous encourageons tout le monde à se renseigner sur l'histoire de ces terres et à soutenir la résistance des indigènes ici et sur l'île de la Tortue. Donc, et sur ce, je donne la parole à ma collègue Candice.
Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle 𝗕𝗫𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 et j'occupe le poste de directrice artistique à 𝗕𝗫𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀. C'est un organisme qui a été fondé en 2017 par 𝗕𝗫𝗲𝗫, dont la vocation est d'offrir un espace aux artistes des communautés africaines et afrodescendantes en alliant créativité et érudition. La discussion Utopie Noire, Black Utopia, pour laquelle nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui, est le fruit d'une collaboration entre 𝗕𝗫𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 et 𝗨𝗪𝗪𝗍 qui vient donner suite à l'exposition 𝗕𝗪𝗪𝗍, ce que nous transmettent nos archives et qui est encore accessible en ligne sur le site de 𝗕𝗹𝗰𝗸 et également en présentiel. On souhaite vraiment remercier 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗀, Sylvain Brochu et tout le reste de l'équipe qui a travaillé sur ce projet et sur cette collaboration.
Donc, et moi, je me présente, je suis Laurent Lafontan, je suis le président de la Fondation 𝗨𝗪𝗪𝗍 et le coordonnateur du festival 𝗨𝗪𝗪𝗍. 𝗨𝗪𝗪𝗍 est un festival des films et des arts LGBTQ+, afro. C'est notre 13e édition. Nous avons lieu dans le cadre du mois de l'histoire des Noirs et notre objectif, c'est que les personnes des communautés queer afro puissent prendre leur place dans ce mois qui commémore les cultures noires en général à travers le monde, et aussi dans ce mois qui reconnaissent les luttes que les personnes noires ont fait dans le passé et continuent de faire pour atteindre l'égalité des droits et l'égalité des chances. Et notre but aussi, c'est de promouvoir la culture LGBT des communautés noires à travers les arts et la culture, parce que nous pensons que dans la lutte contre le racisme et contre l'homophobie, il est aussi primordial de connaître les réalités que vivent ces communautés et les arts, et à travers les arts, que ce soit les films, la photo et toute forme d'expression artistique, ça permet de véhiculer ces vécus. Donc, voilà, sur ce, je repasse la parole à Candice.
Alors, cette discussion va être animée par Omayra Issa, qui est journaliste et animatrice de télévision sur différentes plateformes médiatiques et qui a également dirigé une initiative nationale sur la diversité et l'inclusion à Radio-Canada. Donc, sans plus tarder, je vais passer la parole à Omayra et je vous souhaite de passer un agréable moment et un enrichissant moment.
Hello, everyone. It is truly my pleasure to be here with you. I'd like to start by thanking, of course, 𝗨𝗪𝗪𝗍 and 𝗕𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 for having me today. I'm very excited to moderate this panel on Black Utopias. We have an incredible panel lined up, and I'd like to introduce the panelists we have before we start our important conversation on Black Utopias. We've got Nene Miriam Konate, who's a transdisciplinary artist and facilitator. We also have 𝗕𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗙 African diaspora. And we've got Cyrus Marcus Ware, who's an artist, activist, and of course, the editor of the very important collection of essays, Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada. So without further ado, I just want to get really quickly into this important conversation on Black Utopias. My first question here is, how do you imagine Black utopias? And do you imagine them here or elsewhere? I'll start with Nene on this one.
Hi, and thank you for this question. So I've reflected on this a lot since we had our introductory conversation, all of us. And I think it's very difficult for me to imagine a geo-specific place in which utopia unfolds. I kind of feel like utopia is something that I imagine on like some version of a molecular level, like something that would happen within my body. I think a lot about my own chronic illness, both mental and physical. I think about my father's chronic illness, and I think about how my ideal futures are ones in which my body is just held and functions in ways that are different from the ways that it exists now. And that, of course, has to do with the external environment where I would be living. But I can't say that I have a concrete or tangible idea of what that would be. I think my utopia is synonymous with a wellness that I haven't seen before. And so not necessarily a wellness where I'm not chronically ill anymore or anything like that, but where the pace of my body and the pace of my life is one that matches the environment in which I'm embedded and doesn't feel like it's creating a constant friction. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So seeking balance. Let me throw this question to Cyrus. How do you imagine Black utopias? And I used the plural here because in my understanding, there isn't just one utopia. There's different ways of thinking utopia. So how do you imagine Black utopias, and do you imagine them here or elsewhere?
Yes, I mean, I've been thinking through this question of what an ideal future could look like. You know, what would a future look like wherein Black, queer, and trans people got to live long enough to be elders? You know, what would a future look like where there was a Black affirming space and where Black, disabled, deaf, and mad people had what they needed to survive and thrive? You know, what would it look like in a future where Black people weren't, you know, being subjected to the violences of capitalism every day? So imagining what we don't want as a way of imagining the future. So to me, this Black utopia is less of a physical space and more of a temporal location, because I'm thinking through this in relation to a sense of futurity and this moment being a gateway for a transition into a future world that we're building together now, that our ancestors planted the seeds for, that we continue to water, that we are preparing for. So sort of thinking through the next 7 generations, you know, my great-great-grandchildren, their great-great-grandchildren, you know, may get to live in a world that approximates a sense of freedom and liberation that could be found in a utopia. You know, we actually have more than enough resources. We have enough brilliance. We have enough to do this, to change the world. We just have to want it, and we have to, you know, be ready for what's coming, you know, change. Octavia Butler told us, you know, that in the future it was just going to be change and change and change and change and change. And so we're changing the system into a more utopic one that will allow us to finally rest, one that will allow Black people to feel, as Nina Simone, I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. Well, we would feel it. We would know it in our bodies. And we would all be expected and anticipated. All of us freaks and weirdos, all of us on the margins would be expected and anticipated. So anyways, it's temporal for me rather than a location in a physical place or on a map. It's a place we're getting to, and it's a place that we are very near to at this moment.
Black liberation coming up. Yanis, let me throw this question to you. How do you imagine Black utopias, and how do you imagine them here or elsewhere?
Yeah, similarly to what Nini and Cyrus were saying, I think for me, the idea of utopia, so like the sense of kind of like the kind of ideal life that like Black people like deserve to live, is not necessarily, to me anyways, attached to like a specific location, because when I think of Black utopia, I think of it in more like in like a global sense of the word, and like because there are Black people obviously across the globe, right? And the needs and desires and the ideals of all Black people are not necessarily the same. And so yeah, so to me, it's not necessarily attached to a specific location, more so that it is like more of a sense of like a personal kind of sense of self, and like a personal kind of like freedom and ability to be and live in your own terms without any sort of oppression, without any sort of obstacles, without yeah. So I think for me, that's how I think of the idea of utopias.
As we know, in the future, Black people exist, and we're hoping that they will thrive as well. In the spirit of Sankofa, what can we learn from the past in thinking about this aspirational future that we're all hoping for? Let me start here with Cyrus.
There's this beautiful group out of Chicago, the Ethnic Heritage Ensemble, and they have this beautiful song called Ancestral Song, and in it says, "From my father's mouth I have heard the words of life, only by knowing my past, in my future shall I last," right? And this way of, the Sankofa, the gaze that is looking backwards while moving forward. I think that some of these future worlds that we're trying to build are actually just a return to old ways. That it's not only that we need to reinvent everything and begin anew, but we also need to remember what was working before we tried this current system that is not working. What did we, so thinking through some Indigenous and Black knowledges and histories and archives and I think that we know a lot about what didn't work in the past. But I think we need to spend some time thinking through and looking for what did, so that we can think through what was it like in the world before prisons? Was there other ways that before colonization, were there other ways that we resolved conflict, crisis, and harm that we might want to bring forward? What are some of the ways that were working really well, but colonizers prevented us from practicing, that we might want to bring forward into the future? So I think that this duality of past and future are like an infinity symbol, and turning it on itself. Like we need them together. We need to hold them and read them alongside each other, so we can, imagine and innovate brand new things, but we can do it knowing and rooting it in what has worked well before.
Nene, what do you think about this idea of Sankofa and holding both the past and present together?
Yeah, I mean, I love everything that you said, Cyrus, because I feel that it's so true. So much of accessing utopia is just allowing ourselves the time and space to remember what has already existed in order to be able to manifest what's possible or what has always been possible. And I think, yes, this idea of Sankofa, the idea of like go back and get it, can apply to like long temporal stretches and imagining how several generations before us lived. And I also like to think of it as recalling more immediate pasts and how certain things might have manifested. So thinking of, you know, a moment when you felt safe with your friends, or thinking of a moment when you felt trust, and thinking of the architecture of that moment, what went into it, and your deep knowledge of its possibility because you've experienced it firsthand, and what is required to stretch that moment. Because I think that Utopia is not so much about production as it is about recognizing how malleable the things that we want and need already are, and kind of just, you know, massaging them and kneading them into the longer, like, temporal shapes that we need them to take. And so, yeah, and I think that it came up in both Cyrus and Yanis's interventions that we need rest in order for that to be possible, because so much occurs when we're able to rest, when we're able to dream, when we're able to recall. And so to me, yeah, the idea of Sankofa is deeply intertwined with just the notion of being able to pause or to be still and to recognize what is already coming to us and what is already with us.
Yanis, your thoughts on Sankofa?
I think, again, my thoughts are very similar to Nene's and Cyrus's, because for me, as an artist, it's very important to look. I think it's very important for me to kind of look back and see kind of how, like Cyrus was talking about, like the idea of looking at like what did work, right? Like back then. And so like that made me think of, especially when it comes to kind of treating marginalized communities, and like kind of how in like, for the most part, in the pre-colonial era, regardless of your gender expression, regardless of kind of how you were presenting yourself to the world, you still had you still had a place, and you still had a role, and you still had a community, right? And so like it made me, like, this idea of going back makes me think of going back to kind of the ways in which we were, like the importance of community, right? Like the importance of knowing that regardless of what you were going through, or regardless of like your personal kind of like hurdles and like challenges, you still had a community that you could go back to. And I think nowadays, with like capitalism, with like kind of like the fast-paced world that we're living in, I think it's something that we're like losing a little bit, like this idea of like the sense of community, the sense of like fostering that idea of belonging to a group, belonging to like a family in a sense. And yeah, I think that these interventions made me really think of like the importance of going back to that, because I think that was a very important pillar in like on the continent, like in our pre-colonial times.
This idea of return to indigeneity and Black Indigenous ways of being and seeing, and systems of relating. Let me ask you a little bit about how are Black diasporic imaginaries linked to space and the idea of return? I know all three of you have mentioned that Black Utopia is not necessarily attached to space, but temporality. This idea of return, how does that fit into diasporic ways of imagining the future? Let's start with Nene on this one.
I think it's really interesting to, live in a time where the most widely circulated Black narratives are those of Black Americans who have a very specific view of what the African continent is and what it means to return. And I think that oftentimes we're exposed to images that are a result of American imperialism that are depicting Africa and that are kind of sold to us as a return, but a return to a land and a life to which we might not actually have any claim. Like I'm thinking a lot about like Beyonce's latest film. What was it called? Now that I have to say it, I can't remember, but obviously it's like a pop culture phenomenon and everybody knows. Well, where essentially, you know, she's on the African continent. There's like a mixture of symbols from basically east, west, north, south, like no geopolitical specificity. And the message is like, hello, Black child, like, this is here for you to take. This belongs to you. And I feel like a lot of time, the idea of belonging somewhere and something belonging to you get amalgamated in these messages. And the idea of a return, which really is just a going, gets packaged and sold to us. And there's a great idealization of what it means to just be a Black body on the continent, particularly if you're a member of the diaspora who has been separated from the continent for generations. And this doesn't mean that we can't go to the continent and we can't have, you know, positive experiences and interactions with our ancestral lands. But I think it's important to be cognizant of the fact that, you know, someone isn't necessarily waiting for you to arrive. And there isn't necessarily someone who wants or needs to welcome you. And if you go to a place where you have not physically been before, you're not returning. And I think that a lot of harm can be created when we assume that we're returning.
Saris, let me throw this question to you.
Yeah, this is such a hard one, right? Because of course, I think, you know, my experience is just my experience. And so my experience is that of being, you know, growing up in Toronto and Toronto, but being Southern. My dad's family's Southern. We were on slave labor camps for generations. So trying to trace our family tree is really hard past my great-grandparents because they were the last people born on slave labor camps. And before that, because of the way that they split us up, they broke up our families, they sold us away, they did all of these violent practices. It's really hard to track where our family was even from before, say, 1850. You know, were we in Memphis? Were we in Mississippi? Were we in Texas? Were we somewhere else entirely? Like, it's really hard to track that. So, you know, to me, that's a very specific experience, being in this intergenerational legacy of slave labor camps, you know, because there is no return. There's no, you know, in many ways, there's no beginning and there's no end, because we can't trace back to an origin point because of the ways that the practices were carried out. And we also aren't yet at a place where slave labor is finished. We still have prisons, we still have police. So we're still suspended, you know, like an amber, you know, in a moment of unhoming, of displacement, of never having a root to put down anywhere. And I think that's different than an experience of, say, coming to Turtle Island, which I know is complicated too, and it's not without its complexities. But this particular experience of having no way of even beginning to say an origin of how I got here, and also not knowing what an endpoint would mean, is really hard for those of us who have this legacy of slave labor. You know, I mean, I talked to my grandmother's eldest sister. There was a very large age difference between them. And I talked to her in 1998. I did a video interview with her, and she remembered being on the slave labor camp because, of course, people didn't just leave. Often people took on sharecropping roles and they still stayed living in the tiny fucking cabins and whatever. So she had a memory, you know, she had a memory of pre-1900 being on that slave labor camp. I talked to her in her 90s, and that's a very recent memory, you know. So I'm still kind of grappling with where any sense of home is. Is it Memphis? You know, because that was the last place that we were owned. That's a creepy feeling, you know. What does it mean? And then on the other hand, I have community there and I have family there. So in many ways it is home, but it's also not, you know, it's very complicated. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Yanis, let me ask you the same question.
I think for me, this idea of return, because I grew up on the continent for the most part for like the majority of my life. So like the discourse around like returning back to Africa is not really something that has applied, I'd say, to me. So it's not necessarily something that I've thought about in relation to my own circumstances. And so I think from just seeing it from like outside, I'd say, I think for me, it makes sense for people to kind of want, because of like this, for people to look for, you know, belonging, right? And again, to look for community in a way. And so where else would they go but back to the origin point, right? Like where else would they go but back to the beginning? And so, so I think for me, it makes sense that there is this need of kind of returning back to the continent and kind of like moving back there. But like Nini said, I think it's important to also be critical and think about the privilege that it is, right? Because it is a privilege to just be able to leave America and go to like that's, and so there are these different things that you have to think about. And like Nini said also, how would your arrival impact or influence the people who are already there, right? And so yeah, I think it's a very tricky one. It's like I don't know if we're ever gonna have an answer for that one. So I think it's, yeah. Yeah, I think it depends on, yeah, it's just up to like, I guess I'd say like everyone's personal history or personal like context.
All of us right now are diasporic. We are not living on the continent. We are living outside of the continent on Turtle Island. How do you see Black and Indigenous solidarities on Turtle Island? On this one, let me start with Cyrus.
Thank you. This is something that I'm particularly fascinated by, interested in, committed to. You know, I think like Dr. Tiffany King, who's a scholar who's based out of Atlanta, talks a lot about the fungibility and the fungible conditions, the sort of replaceability, the disposability of Black and Indigenous life on Turtle Island, and how that's created this particular relationship between our two communities. And we've experienced the brunt of colonial violence and policing and prisons and all of these things. And it's created conditions, that are complicated and sometimes fraught, but it's also created possibilities for amazing cross-movement collaboration and solidarity. So with Black Lives Matter Canada, which I'm a co-founder of, we've done a lot of work, and with Black Lives Matter Toronto, to be in solidarity with land back movements and with movements around Indigenous resurgence. And we've seen and witnessed Indigenous communities showing up and being in solidarity with our movements and with our organizing and with our struggles. So when we had Tent City and occupied in front of police headquarters, and it was Indigenous elders who stayed and watched over us at night while we slept and took care of traditional medicine and made sure that we were able to sleep at night because the police kept raiding. And similarly, when they were occupying the INAC offices, we were outside bringing food up and making sure that they had resources and supplies. So we show up for each other in these ways. This summer, and this revolutionary summer that just happened, we were supporting folks in 𝗨𝗁cie𝗽𝗶𝗲, and they were supporting us when we had arrests after the statue demonstrations. So there's been this beautiful way that we, in particularly in recent years, have said, okay, hold on a second here. What are the ways that the system has actively pitted our communities against each other? And in what ways can we come together and actually have the power to topple the system, right? Because of course, we are so strong and there are so many of us. With Black and Indigenous people united, there's a lot that could happen. So I'm also thinking through all of the Afro-Indigenous heroes and activists that I get to work with, Malika Ouare, Raven Wings, all of these incredible Afro-Indigenous folks who are Eden Maximus, all of these folks who are both, who are straddling these two communities, who are saying, actually, we exist here too, and our unique experiences need to be told, and really making space in our movements for Afro-Indigenous leadership seems really core right now. So anyways, I'm really excited about this question because I think that in the future, what we're looking at on Turtle Island, we're going to need to grapple with this. This is a question that we're going to need to grapple with.
Fundamental question. Nene, let me ask you the same question about Black and Indigenous solidarities on Turtle Island.
Yeah, I'm really, I'm grateful for Cyrus's answer because I think that so much of the work that you're doing exemplifies the future that we're reaching for. And I know that when we all had like a meeting in anticipation of this panel, we were talking about how, sometimes fantasies of flight prevent this Black and Indigenous solidarity. If we're always imagining ourselves being elsewhere, then it's harder to actually be in community and be in solidarity with the people that physically surround us, because we view our presence in this place as extremely short term or temporary. And I view, I don't know, and this is just for myself, of course, because there are so many different Black communities on Turtle Island. There are so many different Indigenous communities on Turtle Island. But I think that what stems from us being in dialogue and in community with each other is an understanding of what it even means to have roots in a place that kind of challenges like the capitalist sedentary idea that like you have to be fixed in one place to belong to it. And in being able to share our past and our presence with each other and to understand how all of our ancestors were extremely geopolitically mobile, we can have a greater sense of what it means to be home and what it means to create home. And I think that that's one of the powerful things that can stem from Black and Indigenous solidarities. And I completely agree with Cyrus that spaces in which the voices of people who straddle both these identities are extremely important because we have so much to learn. And I think that so much of how the world operates right now is in attempting to like dissect and separate different realities without acknowledging how porous they all are, and how we kind of all bleed into each other's experiences. So yeah, I think that both in like more like politically organized fashions, Black and Indigenous solidarities are important, and also in intimate relational spaces, in kinships. These are important because in those relationships, we're building the futures that we want to see. We're holding each other in the ways that we want to be held.
Thank you for that. Yanis, let me ask you the same question.
When I think of the solidarity between Indigenous and Black communities, especially in relation to space, I think of kind of the ways in which, like the very similar history these two communities have, right, in terms of the ways in which they've been taken and like kind of they've been moved either to or away from spaces because of external forces, right? And so like Nini and Cyrus both said, there is a lot of similarities, and there is, more importantly, a lot that we can learn from one another. So so I think it's because of the similar history, because of the similar kind of experiences, I think it's for the future, in order to have, in order for the two communities to kind of be and like to kind of live, I'm sorry, this, to kind of be, I don't know how to like,
Okay, it's a complex question.
It's a complex question, but essentially to kind of, in order for everyone to be free of the oppression and the kind of the circumstances that we've been put under, I think collaboration and kinship, like the other panelists have said, is going to be key. And yeah, I think that's what needs to be kept at the forefront of everyone's mind: collaboration, kinship, and sharing.
Thank you for that. Of course, it's impossible to think of our present lives and future lives and utopias without thinking about climate change and climate destruction. How do you envision, connections between the past and future as it relates to climate change? Yanis, I don't know if you can start us with that one.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's again this conversation of, or this idea rather, of going back to kind of the indigenous ways of thinking, right? Like when I think of climate change, I think of nature, and I think of the relationship that our ancestors had with nature, right? Like the respect they had for nature, and like kind of the way because it was such an important and primordial part of their lives and their livelihood and like their existence, the importance of respecting it and like not going out of your way to actively harm the nature and the world around you, right? So I think when I think about like climate change in the future, I think of, again, that we're going to again have to go back to indigenous ways of thinking and like kind of go back to this idea, more respectful and more like cautious ways our ancestors were kind of interacting with the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Cyrus, let me turn to you about this question.
Yeah, I think that, there's, Yana, thank you so much for what you've said. And that's exactly it. We have this, there is this distinct relationship. I mean, in this video that I have that's part of the exhibition, Ancestors Do You Read Us? Dispatches from the Future, it's set in 2072, and it's our great-grandchildren coming back to us, their ancestors, to say, if you don't solve climate change, we don't exist in the future, basically, So please do X, Y, Z. And that's what allows us, and you will. And we believe and know that you will. And that's what allows us to have this beautiful future. So we're coming back to give you this word of encouragement, basically, to be like, just do it. So I think, for this idea of all of our actions affecting 7 generations ahead of us, or this idea that we are present and there's 3 ahead of us and 3 behind that we're always in relation to, whatever way that you sort of think about it, we are the ancestors of a future generation, and our ancestors, we are their great-grandchildren. And we are trying basically to imagine a future on this planet. And the only way that we're going to be able to have a future on this planet is if we solve climate change. So we have resources, we have brilliance, we have artists, scientists, activists, organizers, climate science. We have it all. We're ready to go. We just need to get rid of the sort of crushing effects of white supremacy that is ultimately leading to the demise of all life on this planet. Because it's white supremacy that's fueling capitalism. It's white supremacy that's fueling extractive industries in indigenous communities and on the continent of Africa. It's white supremacy that's fueling all of these things. So we have work to do to dismantle this system of violence in order to make sure that Black life matters, which would mean that all life on this planet matters. Because the Combahee River Collective told us in the 70s, when you make the world safer for those who are most marginalized, you're necessarily making it safer for everyone else. So literally, if we lived in a world where Black lives were considered inherently valuable, and in particular, Black women's lives, Black trans women's lives, Black trans women with disabilities lives, we would necessarily be making the world safer for every blade of grass, for every hummingbird, for every, bee nest. Everything would be better, right? So I think that we get to stand on the shoulders of these giants, of our ancestors who have already been planting the seeds of what we need to do in order to heal this system. We can, continue their work. There's Black revolutionaries like the MOVE organization, who were doing climate justice work and Black justice work in Philadelphia in the 70s and 80s and were highly criminalized. I mean, Mumia Abu-Jamal is still in prison, because of his organizing with MOVE. And it's just come out yesterday that he has COVID now and that people are trying to get him out. So anyways, we can turn to Black revolutionaries, we can turn to Black environmental justice organizers, and we can say, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make sure that we all survive? And that's part of what we do in the movement for Black life. Is it's tied to an environmental justice movement, because that's the only way that we're all going to survive this. And we will.
Nene, let me turn to you about this question of environmental protection and climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, Cyrus. I believe that we will. And I feel like this is also related to Black and Indigenous solidarities, because I think that our communities have an intimate relationship with the notion of apocalypse or the world ending, that makes us, or that enables us to imagine conditions beyond what is immediately visible today. And that we have historically entertained relationships with ourselves and the lands from which we spring that allow both to live. And I believe that it's through kinship and through dialogue that we can imagine the future conditions in which we will be alive. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, climate change that's the terminology under which we understand what is happening now. And at the same time, I think that, you know, most, if not all of us on this panel, in conversations with our elders, were imparted a certain respect for the places in which we live, and encouraged not to have purely extractive relationships with anything and or everything, and to understand ourselves as parts of a whole. Because I think that one of the weirdest, the weirdest things for me to witness under white supremacy are conversations about climate change in which, like, the climate is a concept that is separate from humanity, and that people are separate from climate, and that the planet is just this thing, etc. And that there don't seem to be that many holistic conversations about the whole that we compose together. And I think that a big part of addressing basically the raping and pillaging of this earth is in honoring the pace of our own bodies and slowing everything down, because white supremacist capitalism is an accelerant that forces us to go like this and to not be able to take stock of the impact of that velocity. And yeah, I feel like I'm just like thinking out loud and not being coherent right now. But those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I get your point around a holistic approach to the environment. You know, we've heard through this conversation mentioning around the 7 generations, and also the past and future being held together at the same time in our imaginaries. Let me ask you about archives. How do we think through our archives as they relate to our utopias and our futures? For this one, let me start with Nene, since you just gave us your last answer.
Last week, I attended a wonderful Zoom event that was facilitated by Joséphine Denis, and was highlighting the work of 𝗨𝘁cie and Monica and Morina Blin, who are all, Afro-Caribbean diasporic archivists and artists. And 𝗨𝘁cie mentioned being an ancestor in training and reflecting on what traces to leave behind for future generations, and talked about documenting themselves in the most mundane acts. So recording themselves taking a nap so that future generations, if they're, in the future equivalent of Google or whatever, looking for Black person sleeping, then there would be at least 10, 15 videos of 𝗨𝘁cie just sleeping. Or, taping their cell phone to their ceiling and just dancing and recording it, or just leaving their recorder on and recording conversations with their mom and their sister in the kitchen, and on their own, and these are personal archives that are not shared at the moment, but it's a practice of building a personal archive of Black affect that isn't easy to find in current archives, because what has been popular to document has been, Black struggle, etc., in institutions of power, because that's the lens through which we're framed. But I think of how even in the immediacy of archiving on a platform, for example, like Instagram, where you can see Black people living their lives and sharing various aspects of them daily, you're able to have a window into a world that maybe looks like yours, that maybe looks like the world that you would like to live in. And you're able to kind of touch some of those utopias and recognize their architectural elements, and then repurpose them for yourself. So I think that archiving kind of contributes to the conversation we were having earlier about Sankofa, about being able to kind of touch the pasts that have already been possible. And I think a lot of this happens also just in dialogue, like when you're having conversations with your parents and your grandparents or your great-grandparents, if you're fortunate to be living simultaneously with them. There's so much to learn about who you are, what made your life possible, and who you can be. And without those oral archives, without those embodied archives, it's difficult or almost impossible to imagine the infrastructures of our utopias.
I love this idea of archiving Black quotidian life and Black joy for our futurities. Cyrus, let me ask you the same question around archiving Black life as it relates to the future.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I'm part of this the community collective called Marvelous Grounds that was originated by Dr. Jen Harita Warren, and it does just that. It aims to archive 𝗕cie𝗶𝗲 Toronto. So 𝗕cie𝗶𝗲 space making, 𝗕cie𝗶𝗲 community building and world building. And through that research project, I got to interview folks like Monica Forrester, a Black trans woman here who's been a long time, like 25, 35 years, organizer and activist, sex worker activist, organizer, who's so brilliant. And we talked, and she said, that she wished that she had been able to save more ephemera from the 70s, from the 80s. But she said that, that the Black trans people that she was living with and surviving with, they were so focused just on trying to survive past 30, they didn't have the capacity to archive. And I was like, oh, hold on though, because in fact, the responsibility wasn't on them to do the archiving. It's on these other archives that were rapidly archiving all this other queer and trans history, just not the history of Black, queer, and trans people. So the responsibility is on these white archives to have done a better job. So anyways, I've been really interested in this idea of counter-archiving, where we get to archive, yes, the quotidien, the daily experiences of our lives. We get to create an archive when we're standing together outside the party, talking about what happened in the community that week or with our days. We get to create an archive when we're, when we're dancing and celebrating together at Pride, that's an archive. It's an embodied archive of movement. We get to create archives in oral storytelling as we repeat and tell stories about people who have come before us and have passed. So we're building archives all the time. I think a lot about what kind of archives we're going to need in the future in order for people to not make the same mistakes that our generations before us made, in order for us to maybe finally learn that colonization is never okay, in order for us to not fall back into ableist thinking or carceral logics or whatever. So what do we need once we've changed this world? What do we need to hold on to help people remember never again? never again. So anyways, I think archives are really essential, and I'm excited that we're in this moment now where so many people are thinking through, what does it mean to be remembered? What do we want to remember? What are we going to hold on to as we go into this future? So thanks for this question.
Thank you for your answers. Just a reminder to people who are logged in at this moment that you can definitely send your questions below, and we'll make sure that the panelists answer them. 𝗫𝗔, let me ask you this question around archiving our lives for our futures.
Yeah, so when I think about archive, I think about the history of the African continent and kind of how so much of it and has been stripped away and like has been has disappeared essentially, right, forever now, and has been lost because of colonization and the colonial enterprise. And so I think of the importance of, like the panelists said before me, like the importance of seeing, for me, the most important thing about archive is the ability to kind of see how, like the ability to kind of be critical in a way about our past mistakes, right? Like the ability to see kind of what did work, but also what didn't work, and like what we should not bring with us in the future. And so, but the issue is if we do not have access to said archive, we're not able to know, we're not able to navigate towards the future, right? We're not able to know what worked and what didn't work for our communities and for our very specific context. And so I think it's very important, kind of like Nini said, for us now today to kind of be the ones to create these archives and like these kind of this bank of information for people in the future to be able to look back and to kind of see the ways in which we were like relating to the world and how it hopefully informs their own life and their own future.
Thank you. I think this is a beautiful place to end. Now is the time for a Q&A. Thank you to everybody who has sent their questions, and just a little reminder, you can as well send your questions as we go through this Q&A. A very interesting question that came from the public. How do you think future generations will perceive your perspective artworks as we talk about archives? It seems like a very timely question. So 𝗫𝗔, let me start with you. You're of course a beautiful artist, and in great admiration of your work. How do you think future generations will perceive your work?
Thank you. I think for me, the kind of work I try to create is I try to, with my photography, tell like an idealistic, like tell the story of kind of the ideal world that I would like for us to live in. So so in my mind, I would hope that kind of the feeling of the sense of kind of freedom and power that I try to depict through my images is, I would hope that this is, their lives, right? Like I would hope that it's a representation of the life that they reached. And because for me, it's just an ideal for me, right? It's just a dream and like a fantasy, but the goal is for it to be reached one day, and for people to actually, like actual Black people, to be able to live this life one day. And so I hope that future generations perceive my artwork as something that is representative of their experiences and their own stories.
All three of you are important artists working today Let me ask the same question to you, Cyrus. How do you think future generations will perceive your work?
I mean, I hope that they see it as the offering that it's meant to be. I mean, in a lot of ways, my work attempts to make the revolution irresistible, as 𝗕𝗫liche𝗽𝗶𝗲 encouraged us all to do, but it also tries to be a bit of an archive. So I've written thousands of love letters to activists through this activist love letter project. I've drawn portraits of activists larger than life, to try to create an archive of activism in this moment. So I'm hoping that these works offer a record of what's happened here in this place, what's happening with Black activist culture, what's happening in our world. And then the future projects that I've done that are set in the future, I hope that they don't laugh at my imaginings of what their future world will be like, but I hope that they see these as potential seed planting that maybe helped to get to where they eventually are.
Seed planting. Nini, I believe you too have mentioned seeds at the very, very beginning of our conversation. How do you think future generations will perceive your work?
I mean, I have absolutely no idea how they will perceive my work. I think that my own perception and understanding of my work is perpetually in flux. Because most of my work is question-driven and dialogue-based. So I don't know, I hope that future generations will feel that my work is irrelevant to their context, that they'll just be like, oh yeah, like we already know that. We don't actually need this anymore. So like, yeah, we're past that. It's cute that you did that, good for you. But actually we're just on a whole different vibration now. But that's cute. I hope that they're just living in a reality that's so vastly different from mine that yes, on a base level, they can understand what my work was or is. And at the same time, that they have no use for it because they have better things.
Great, thank you. I like that idea of the ephemeral and surpassing of imaginaries. Another question, how do you see a notion such as shape-shifting, specifically knowing how Africana experiences and knowledges are always at work towards the humankind? So this idea of shape-shifting Africana experiences as they relate to humankind. And the person put quotation marks, and I think the quotation marks seek to problematize this idea of humankind. So let me start with Cyrus on this one.
Hey, that's the notion of shape-shifting. I mean, I think that we're in this moment right now where we're in a profound systems change. Like the entire world is literally morphing into something different. We're seeing our communities turn into a different thing and look different because of the pandemic and because of social distancing. And we're seeing revolutions spring up all over the planet and revolutionary action, which is never a one-time event, but a process, spreading all over. So we're in a moment where the entire system is shape-shifting. And I think that what we're seeing is this widespread Black leadership, that is informing and inspiring a lot of these shifts and changes. And so once again, we are doing the work, and in particular, Black women largely and femmes doing the work of shaping and changing the world, right? So I just think so much about how there's this beautiful artwork by Anique Jordan, which simply says, "We've done enough. We've done enough." And I think about that. I think about how, the origin of human history coming out of the continent. I think about the generations of labor that we gave, that we've given, to try to make, to try to undo colonialism, to try to to work towards abolition, to generations of people fighting for change, you know, and then of course in the last 5 years, this dramatic upswing with the Black Lives Matter movement, and how many people have just worked their asses off working for change. And Anika's saying, we've done enough. We've done enough. And so I think how much we've given as Black people to this earth and to this planet. And I think that we're continuing to give and to shape and to do all of this change. But I also look forward to this moment where we get to rest, where the shifting has settled, where we've created the world that we want to be in, and where we can finally just get to be, you know, and not have to always be doing all of the leadership to change the world. So.
Yanis, let me ask you the same question around shape shifting and as well as humanity.
I don't think I understand the question.
I think the question is seeking to understand, you know, notions of shape shifting, which I think is also a part of indigenous mythologies around people who are not just limited to one set of being and one set of things, and how that knowledge can relate to humankind.
I think similarly to what Cyrus said, I think it relates to humankind because of how we're currently in we're currently into a phase where we're shifting, right? Like so much of what we know about the world is changing, and our relationship with the world, our relationship with each other are changing dramatically. And so I think, I think this idea of shape shifting relates that way, because it's such a complicated question, honestly. I'm not sure I understand it, like, completely, but I'd say yes, because of I think about especially the current context we live in currently. And so I think these experiences are informing kind of the rest of the world.
Thank you for that. Nini, it is now your turn if you wanted to contribute. And, you know, I should say you don't have to answer any questions if you don't feel comfortable either to the panelists. But Nini, how do you feel about this question around humanity and shape-shifting and the moment we're in right now?
I mean, I find it really interesting to have a question about humanity or humankind in quotations and Blackness, because so much of what has come to define humanity or humankind has been created in contrast with the mythology of Blackness. So as Black folks, we were always supposed to exist outside of the definition of what is human. And many of our ancestors have tried to kind of contort and bend over backwards to fit into that definition, to access, you know, material necessities and or rights. And I find that it's interesting to be living in a moment when many people are just refusing that category entirely, and willing to, well, living in a time, there have always been people who have done this, maybe living in a time when there are several accessible conversations about refusing this identity that we were never invited to fully be part of. And that makes me think of this book by Legacy Russell, Glitch Feminism, in which she says, "We cannot wait around to be remembered, to be humanized, to be seen. It is our responsibility collectively to infect, and as we prompt social seizure, to bear witness and to and for one another, to make impossible pathways secure and viable as all else short circuits towards a triggered collapse. And so I think of our shape-shifting as being able to serve as like a mirror for humanity, serve as a force that constantly redefines what humanity is and wants to be, and also to be a force that is capable of collapsing this very notion of humanity as an exclusionary construct, and liberating ourselves through this collapse.
I love that, the idea of liberation. Now, another actually very interesting question to the three panelists. Do you have artists or writers that have inspired your work around archives and thinking about futures, Black futurities? Nene, I'll maybe ask you the question first.
Yes, but I think honestly, I think everyone I've ever known in how they've relayed their lived experience to me and or just talked about themselves and or their ancestors have influenced me. And in terms of people that I've never met and am grateful to have been able to get a glimpse into their world through their work. I think of 𝗕𝗫𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 Kincaid and particularly her book, A Small Place, where I feel like she does such a wonderful job of portraying emotion as archive, and explaining how the everyday can be a site of, I don't know, like of historical reenactment, how every moment can be fraught and can be charged. And so I'm grateful to have been able to read her words. I think of poets like Billy Ray Belcourt and Tom Pico, who also have just a beautiful way of illustrating through like small interpersonal interactions, like the worlds and the histories that are unfolding in those small moments. I mean, there's like a million more, but those are the ones that come to mind, and I want other people to speak, so I'll stop now.
Yanis, your inspirations could be writers, could be artists in your work around archives and future.
Yeah, so when I think about archives, I think more particularly about images. And so, so photography and kind of like the ways in which images kind of like informed the ways in the way people related to each other, right? So I think of a scholar named Amy Saul, whose work I followed for years, and so who really, I think she was one of the first people I've seen who took a particular interest in images coming out of the African continent in the pre-colonial or post, especially the post-colonial era, and kind of how Africans themselves were able to kind of take back a control of their narrative and a little bit of their agency by actually being the author in these archives, right? By actually, for the first time in the history of the continent, by being the ones actually recording, actually doing the recordings, actually making the films, actually taking the photos. And so, yeah, her work really inspired and challenged me also, like challenged my way of thinking about myself, where I came from, and that relation with the rest of the world. And there has also been other artists and writers, artists like Lina Iris Victor. She's a painter whose work is also really informed by history and by archive and by like pre-colonial traditions and like kind of aesthetic. And these kind of artists allow me to really allow me to think about how important it is, again, to kind of go back to the past and see kind of how, like the ways in which people lived, but also how people created.
Wonderful. Cyrus, your inspirations and people who might have influenced your work around archives and futures?
Yeah, thank you. I'm definitely inspired by 𝗕𝗹𝗰𝘲 for sure. And this idea of creating speculative futures that are based on a true understanding of what's happening in the present. Also the speculative futures work of Nalo Hopkinson and all of her writing and books. Nalo is based out of California and wrote Brown Girl in the Ring and Midnight Robber and Salt Roads and just so many incredible books. The visual art work of Afrofuturist Camille Turner and her Afronautics Research Lab really inspires me. Yeah, I think that there's been quite a few people that have helped me to sort of think through what is my relationship to the future, and what is my relationship as a result to the past and to the archives. I would definitely say a shout out to the Marvelous Grounds Collective, so Jenna Rita Warren, Ria Rodriguez, and Khaida Musa, who with them I got to explore my archive fever and got to look into how to create creative archives. Also 𝗨𝘁𝗶𝘀 in that collective as well, and to imagine archiving creative practices and archiving performance and archiving the unarchivable. So very thankful to all of those folks. And then, I'm really interested in music as a transformative process. And there's an electronic music duo named 𝗨𝘁, Rosina Kazi and Nick Murray, and their work explores activism and social justice. And it is a document, their 20-year history is a document of activism in Toronto for the last 20 years, the Living Archive. And their work is also futurist in thinking and lens, and is about systems change and is about imagining a future. So I'm also thankful to them for their music and their creativity and the ways that they do that. Oh, and Raven Davis and Raven Wings. I mean, there's just so many. I'm very moved by the brilliant folks that we have here in this north part of Turtle Island who are thinking such beautiful thoughts and helping us to expand our consciousness around the idea of both remembering and archiving, but also about our futures. So thanks to all of them.
Nice. Another question that is similar to the previous one: as Black people, do you consider it important to have a grasp of African philosophy in your pursuit of art? I know Sankofa came up, and there are other concepts, of course. Whoever wants to start first. Maybe Cyrus, since we have you
Sure.
here.
Yeah, I think we need to undo the whitening practices of educational settings and of traditional pedagogy, that create a canon that is only rooted in Western thought, that, produces students that sort of come out of these educational settings with this idea that that's all that's happened. I literally had a professor in undergraduate say that Black women didn't start making art until the 1970s because they were focused on issues of colonization and migration.
Wow.
How do you get paid to, how are you saying these words? So I think that there's a way within these within our educational institutions where we have had our stories written out, where we've had our stories erased, where outright lies, like the ones that professor told, were perpetuated as knowledge and as fact. And as a result, we do come out of these, educational opportunities with these really limited understandings of what is out there. So I think as artists, as community members, we need to undo that work, undo what that white supremacy that is, burrowed into our brain through that education, and educate ourselves and educate our communities. I mean, the Black Panthers had this idea of each one teach one, that we, it was our responsibility to share knowledge with each other, to help each other, to learn about our communities and our histories. And I think that that's really crucial right now, is that we need to undo these whitening practices in education and build our own things. And so I love seeing, freedom schools popping up, and activist, intensives, and all of these great teach-ins that are happening, where people are getting a chance to share, to share about African culture, to share about African diasporic culture, to be able to broaden our understanding outside of just a really limited Western scope. And I'm really here for that. I'm really excited about that. So that's what I would have to say about that. I do think we need to have an understanding of, I suppose in the question it's African philosophy, but I would say in general, sort of African thought. We need to all undo what has been done to us through a colonial white supremacist system that has limited our ability to understand and process our histories and where we've come from.
Thank you for that. So Nene, I'll ask you the same question around African thought and African philosophy.
Yeah, what you were saying, Cyrus, made me think of three things. You first made me think of this talk that Fred Moten gave with 𝗕𝗫 and Adrian Brown towards the beginning of the pandemic, which feels like ages ago, where Fred Moten invited everyone who was tuning in to make a concerted effort not to be white. And I found that to be a beautiful invitation and recognition of the ways in which white supremacy seeps into our daily lives and daily actions. And then this made me think of Raven Davis, who you mentioned. And I remembered seeing an article about Raven Davis where they talked about, receiving, I can't remember if it was their BFA or their MFA from their grandma, and acknowledging how there was so much more to be learned in that intergenerational relationship than could ever be learned in institutional academic context. And I found that to be I found that to be true, to be beautiful, to be inspiring. This made me think also of a conversation that I had with my parents once, where they were saying how, people here are like so obsessed with knowing what people do. Like people know what people do before they know who people are. Whereas, for example, my dad growing up, the way that he would know about someone was knowing like who that person's siblings were and who that person's parents were. And like if that person would be someone that he would run into on his way to do his daily activities. And that's how he mapped out his relations, through kind of their emotional proximity to other people that he knew. And there were many adults that he grew up knowing, having no idea what they did in a productive or capitalist sense, and still having an intimate knowledge of who they were. And so that's not like a return to African philosophy or anything like that. It's just a return to my dad's understanding of relationality. And I find that to be, important because so much of the time, the art that we produced is read through this lens of us being synonymous with our output, when really anything that we create is just providing a small glimpse into who we are and what we do. And all of these things are ultimately made possible through our relations.
Thank you for that. Yanis, you get the last word on this one.
Yeah, so I think for me, when I think about that question, I think about the importance of kind of going beyond the institutions that we have been taught to think of as references, right? And so, but I think when I think about that, like kind of like Cyrus said, right, it's going to be very important to kind of think beyond like the kind of like whiteness, like the white supremacists and capitalists institutions and kind of like ways of thinking that we've been conditioned to see as important, especially when it comes to art. And so that makes me think of especially value. And so like the value we attribute to the different institutions and platforms related to the art world, right? Like, so who has like the control and who has the agency and who has the influence to kind of dictate what the rest of the world is supposed to think of as good, worthy, and important art, right? And so I think when we start to think about the history and the kind of like the mission of these institutions a little more critically, we're able to see how in many ways it fails us as marginalized people, and how trying to fit under and trying to be a part of these institutions does not do nothing but kind of like delay our true and inevitable like independence and épanouissement. I don't know how to say it in English, but yeah, so it makes me think of, it's going to be, I think for us as Black people, it's important to think beyond like the institutions that we've been taught to see and respect as worthy and valuable.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are nearing the end of our wonderful conversation. I'd like to remind everybody that there's an incredible show happening right now with Never Apart, where you can see the works of our panelists. Ancestors, Can You Read Us? Dispatches from the Future and Antarctica by Cyrus Marcus Ware. We've also got Boy Wives and Female Husbands plus Silicon Sunsets and Eclectic Identity plus 2050 by Yanis 𝗕𝗹𝗰𝗸𝗀, and so much more. So please, please, please take the time to enjoy this incredible work that is being done right now by artists, Black artists, Black thinkers and revolutionaries, people that we need right now in our lives. So you can find that on the website, neverapart.com at exhibitions. And you can also find data at 𝗕𝗹s, how do we transmit our archives. And yeah, you'll be able to also see it in person if you prefer to see it in person, all the way to March 27th. I would like to take this moment to thank, of course, Yanis, Cyrus, Nene, to thank as well 𝗕𝗹𝗰𝘂𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗶 and 𝗵𝗲𝗍. This is an incredible initiative, and it is truly my honor to have been in conversation with all the three of you and to be part of this event. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody in the audience who was here with us, and we hope that you will engage with this incredible and important work. Thank you so much, and happy Black futurities, really.